All right, hello. As always, thank you for your time. Today we're going to start part two of engagement. Part two is going to, the last part was on volume and tone. Part two is going to be on speed, and then part three is going to be all the conversations between Renee and myself on this subject, which I kind of think of as like checking the work of my math. Like I'm kind of explaining all the anatomy and physiology using my vocabulary and system, and I'm also teaching you how to observe for yourself, and then you can go check my work and see if you're seeing what I'm seeing. And honestly, I hope people, find. I think I've gotten to a point where my description was pretty comprehensive, but I hope that people leave YouTube comments and notice things that I don't. So let's dive right in. So the first thing that we need to talk about is aligning the wrist with the forearm using the shoulder to arm joint. And you want to feel when you're at the center of your range of motion, because if you just bring your forearm in contact with the guitar and then you hold the wrist in the center of its range of motion and then you just let it drop with gravity, it's going to flex downward and it's going to deviate towards the pinky. And when you're in that position, you should feel tension in a number of different areas. You should feel some tension spreading where the fingers spread. You should feel some tension around the bottom of the wrist where it meets the forearm. You should feel maybe some tension of skin and tendons and muscles stretching on the top of the wrist. And remember from the prior videos in the series, the reason for that tension is you're feeling the skin and tendons and muscles stretch. And part of that has to do with the tendons that operate, the muscles and tendons that operate the finger. The muscles are in the forearm. They run through the wrist carpal tunnel, those tendons, and then they attach to the fingers. So when you contract muscles in the forearm, it controls the fingers. So when you move the wrist, it pulls those tendons, which affects the fingers. And so if you really flex your wrist, it's going to extend the fingers and abduct them, which is going to happen a little bit even when you just let it fall passively from gravity. And so those areas, the fingers, the top of the wrist, where the wrist meets the forearm and the back, and even a little bit around the thumb, like if you feel right around here, the base of the thumb, all those areas are places you're going to want to feel as you're going from a flexed wrist to the center of its range of motion. And if you try this movement right now, this seesaw displacement type, you'll go until you get to where you're basically using gravity. Like once you get in, what's happening is like as you use gravity, as you use the seesaw motion to bring it to the strings, and then use the strings to kind of help you aid it, like that contact with the strings also helps you with this movement. As you go from flexed to the center of its range of motion, you feel the tension in those areas I described or just pointed out disappears. That's how you feel going from flexed to relaxed. And I would recommend also going a little bit hyperextended and feeling that, especially in the back around where the wrist meets the forearm, and then letting it relax again until you're in the center of your range of motion. So that's part one of engagement. Part two is using the shifting forearm contact point displacement type to, again, adjust flexion and extension. Because while the main, like 80% of that is done with the seesaw, once you're in contact with the strings, if your contact point is really close to the elbow, you're going to flex the wrist if you stay in contact with the strings. And as you pull it backwards with the contact point being close to the wrist, you're going to get a more extended posture of the wrist. And so again, you kind of want to mix and do flex and extend it until you feel the tension in those areas go away. I found that the sweet spot for all of this tends to be when I can get a nice, good thumb free stroke and I'm getting both flesh and nail, and that's really comfortable. I'm finding increasingly that while all those areas are points of reference in terms of being the center of the range of motion, for me, I know I'm really in the sweet spot when I can get a good rest stroke and get all the other strokes I need with the other fingers as well. Sorry, get a good free stroke and rest stroke with the thumb. Next thing we need to do is deviation. Now for deviation, you're going to want to feel on the side, the pinky side, and the thumb side, kind of around here, and also around the forearm. Because remember, the deviation muscle is either for pinky. So when you're pulling this way, there's a muscle in the forearm that's pulling the wrist towards the pinky. And then when you're letting it hang like this, where we start, the muscle that deviates towards the thumb is being stretched. So if we go back to this position, we're going to feel some, I want you to feel here, when you let that wrist go from neutral to deviated and then flexed, you're going to feel some tension as the kind of around the thumb area, on the top of the thumb, and this side of the wrist, the thumb side of the wrist, as that muscle is being stretched. And when you, again, come into contact using the seesaw and the shifting forearm displacement type, contact point displacement type, and then you use the elbow, and as you extend the elbow out, you're going to get thumb deviation, and as you flex the elbow in, you're going to get pinky deviation. So whether you choose to do Segovia or the modern school and Renee's alignment, you're going to want to go here until you're not feeling any tension anywhere around the wrist and inside the wrist and hand. Now, it's a little unclear to me as of this time of making this video whether once you're at the center of the range of motion, you're good. It's a little unclear to me from talking to Renee in his videos if there's a little bit more deviation towards the thumb, because he kind of describes a sort of locking feeling in motion. And so again, kind of one of my guides is how much tension do I feel, and can I get a good free stroke with all the fingers and a good thumb stroke as well. Well, the thing that I would say is one of the things that they probably do is, like, if there's ever a case where you lose contact with the strings, they're probably always using a little bit of thumb side wrist muscle deviation to at least hold it in place, so that if you lose contact with the strings because you need to at a point in the passage, the wrist doesn't just drop. Also keep in mind too that because the tendons run through the carpal tunnel that can affect the fingers, part of the reason for any of this is just to hold it in place. Because it's kind of intuitive. If I'm rotating my forearm all over the place and I'm moving my wrist all over, I'm not going to be able to play a very fast passage. I think that's intuitive. You can see that and intuitively get that yourself visually. But the other part of it is because those finger tendons run through the carpal tunnel of the wrist, any movement of the wrist is going to affect the fingers as well. So all those things are reasons you don't want to let the wrist move when you're trying to play fast. And I think that's a big part of engagement. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is hold it in place. There might be some additional deviation towards the thumb, either using the elbow or using some wrist tension. I think if you're really feeling it around where the forearm meets the wrist, that's too much. If there's a lot of tension there, that's probably too much. But it's kind of about holding it in place. And one thing that Renee and I discussed, you can hear us talk about in the video, is like, it's the opposite of the Segovia school, where you deviated towards the pinky. And even though, again, I don't subscribe to this technique because of all the tension I feel from that, and from the fact that you're out of the center of the line of its range of motion and the tendons run through there. Nonetheless, it's undeniable that great players have played like that, like Theobald Garcia is a modern classical guitar player, did that. Ida Presti and Segovia from the old school. Christopher Marketing played very well using that wrist. So I can't tell you it's wrong or that it can't be done, only that because of that tension and because of those tendons running through the wrist, I don't personally like it. What the connection I'm trying to make is this, that part of the reason that technique does work is that, one, there's a little bit of flexion and pinky deviation, a substantial amount of pinky deviation that can be done, and the fingers can still function in a way that's usable. But the other part of it is that once you let it hang, you can, the idea is that they were trying not to fight gravity, but the other part of it too is once it's hanging, you can just kind of move from the bass strings to the trebles and not be in contact with the strings, and pretty much keep a consistent wrist alignment because it's just hanging. Whereas when you're in the Renee school, there does need to be some, quote, engagement to hold it in place, because if I didn't do that, it would just drop with gravity. Now, another aspect of this is you want to keep in mind, we've talked about in prior videos, but you want to make sure that when you're engaged, your forearm is in the center of its range of motion at all times. You don't want to be rotating it towards the palm up or rotating this way. You don't want to feel any tension there. We've talked about that in prior videos, but I just want to remind you that for this modern Renee school, you don't do that. Now, in the old school of Segovia and even like flamencos, you can shift the forearm over, so the contact point doesn't change in terms of where it is in the forearm, but you move it over and you allow a little bit of gravity to push the forearm a little bit more palm down, more pronated. So you go from like this to like this, and that puts you between that and the wrist being deviated towards the pinky. You end up playing more off the center or even off the left side of the nail, and so it cuts through the string more, which is helpful for that rest stroke driven classical Spanish approach and or the flamenco Spanish rest stroke driven approach. One thing that I want to point out is that if you watch the videos, Renee will say like this is relaxed, and then this is engaged. And this is where things get kind of messy. Like I said, he's kind of describing multiple things at the same time. Because if you think about it in terms of the tension of the wrist, the way the wrist feels and its alignment in relation to the forearm, there's a lot of tension here and it's not engaged. But if you think of it in terms of the shoulder to arm joint and the elbow, which he says, you got to let the elbow come up, and you can see that when he goes from not engaged to engaged, the shoulder to arm joint is very much, the muscles are very much exerting, because if you let this joint and its muscles relax, the elbow would just fall down. And so there is some engagement, quote unquote, of those muscles and that joint that needs to be done in order to make this alignment of the forearm and the wrist happen. And you can see that elbow coming from sort of behind the guitar to, up and out. Another thing that came up in the conversation about engagement was pressing into the forearm contact point a little bit. It would be like this motion. I'm going to exaggerate it, but it would be like you're pressing like this. Renee discusses in the context of bar chords. There's a little bit of like pulling in to the guitar when you're to help facilitate bar chords. If you look at the conversations we have, we kind of go back and forth on this. At first he says, no, I don't think you need to do that. And he says, well, maybe a little bit. And then there's a later video that because I've spliced a bunch of videos together in the conversation between him and I. There's one where he agrees with it. So I think when you make the seesaw motion, there's almost by default a little bit of pulling in. And you don't want to overdo it, but there is just a little bit of tension of like this movement, of bringing it in. And it helps with a couple of things. One is that it helps with stability, so that the whole arm isn't moving a whole lot. And it also reduces bouncing from playing, but it's minimal. Like it's almost a byproduct of using that seesaw lever displacement type to get into alignment. You don't want to overdo it, and it might not be there. I would recommend watching the videos of him and I and experimenting for yourself. All right, the next part of engagement has to do with the tip and middle joints of the fingers. Now, this one is tricky for me, so I'm going to tell you what, like two or three things that I think could be going on with this, and then again, you'll be able to watch the conversation between Ray and I and decide for yourself. So part of it is that, like, if you use that shifting forearm contact point, so let's say you put your middle finger in contact with the E string. If you shift that forearm contact point towards the wrist, you're going to see that you end up with a little bit more. You're like reaching towards that high E string. Whereas when you shift it a little bit further forward, you're going to sort of be coming over the string. This middle joint is going to be either over the string or slightly sort of like below it, meaning this way. And that's going to affect how much knuckle and how much tip and middle joint are involved in your stroke for free and rest stroke. And the other part of it too is that I think it's a little bit unclear to me whether, like, as he changes that contact point and thus the position of that middle joint in relationship to the string, whether it's below it, on top of it, or behind it. The other part too is, like, is he using more of? Because remember, in one of the prior videos we talked about how the stroke is a flexed knuckle joint with extended middle and tip, and then those two flex, and then both motions reverse to get back to the center of the range of motion and start the whole thing over again. Well, it seems to me that what he's saying is that that position of that middle joint in relationship to the string it's playing, as positioned by that forearm contact point displacement type, affects how much, whether it's just like a knuckle-driven stroke or whether there's more middle and tip joint action involved. And so I think that's one thing to consider when watching him. I kind of think what's going on is that he stiffens the middle and tip joint a bit, because if you didn't stiffen those two, as you pluck through, especially for free stroke, the tip joint of the finger especially is going to extend a bit with the string and then pluck, which is going to slow you down a little bit if I use a more string-like thing. So if I play and then I press the string down towards the soundboard, what's going to happen is that tip joint's going to extend and then pluck through, which is going to slow you down because it's got to go from in the center of its range of motion, extended, and then flex and driving through the string. So if you stiffen and tighten up those fingers a bit as you do the stroke, especially for rest stroke, what you're going to find is that it's going to cut through the string more, and you're not going to get that tip and middle joint extension that might potentially slow you down. And I think part of the reason that's what I think he's describing is that when we circle back to talking, or when we get to the part where we're going to talk about left hand engagement, he very clearly talks about flexing the fingers. And in a lot of cases, the left hand is kind of an upside down right hand. So while it is possible that there's more middle and tip movement in the stroke, I think a lot of it is more holding those a little bit stiff, so that they don't, they kind of just cut through the string. Now, if you want to transition from rest stroke to free stroke, remember you got to go, there's really two things. One is that you want to shift the form. If you're sitting like, all right, now the next thing with engagement we need to talk about is transitioning from free to rest stroke. And there's two ways that you can transition from free to rest stroke. You can also use a combination of either. And so, as an example, if you do a deviated wrist towards the pinky, with or without wrist flexion, you're going to find that your angle of attack is more perpendicular to the strings that you're playing either up the center of the nail on the fingertip or the left side. So it's going to be easier to cut through the strings more, because if you're coming at an oblique angle and you're trying to do rest stroke, you're going to kind of, with rest stroke, so if this is free stroke, when you go to rest stroke, the forearm contact point shifts closer to the wrist, and so and you get more perpendicular to the string, and so what happens is two things. One, you're pressing downwards towards the soundboard, which gives you more volume, which is why rest stroke tends to be louder than free stroke. Two, when you're more perpendicular, you're kind of cutting through the string. Like you wouldn't want to karate chop through a board of wood at an angle. You want to go right down the center. And then the other element of it too is as you shift that forearm contact point closer to the wrist, you'll see that it brings the finger more, it brings this middle joint from being more above the string you're playing on to more behind it. And when that happens, if you look here, the back of the finger gets closer to the next adjacent string. So part of the reason that rest stroke can be so fast, if you look at like flamenco guitars, is that it restricts the motion a little bit organically, because when you go backwards, you're going to hit that next adjacent string real quickly because you move so far back, and that's going to stop you, which is going to let you get a little bit more speed because you're not going so far. And so that's one of the speed benefits of it. And so to kind of summarize all that, you have, the wrist deviation, and then you also have the ability to use the shifting forearm contact point, both shifting this way and shifting towards the wrist, so that you can get between. Basically what I'm trying to get at is it's a combination of both. It's shifting the forearm contact point close to the wrist. It's moving it a little bit towards this way, and then it's letting the wrist deviate towards the pinky, so that your angle of attack for rest stroke and the fingers is either perpendicular. It's perpendicular, so that you're either off the center of the nail or off the left side of the nail. Now, because of Renee's posture that we discussed in the prior video, because it's tilted back and it's up at an angle, you can shift to this position without having to do much to shift. But there are, I guess what I'm trying to get at right now is that certain positions, seating positions, are going to facilitate the type of movement you do in terms of right hand displacement types to make the shift from free to rest stroke. But at the same time, there's no hard and fast rule. So one example would be the way Paco de Lucia plays. So he plays, sometimes like cross-legged, with the guitar tilted back a little bit. So again, kind of like Renee's thing, with it's tilted back so you can reach around it. And then if you watch what he does when he's playing chords, he'll do this. But then when he switches to doing a rest stroke passage, you'll see him let the wrist deviate, and he'll bring the whole arm up. And so what happens is, one, you get that alignment of the wrist, in terms of flexion and extension, more aligned with the wrist. But then you get some pinky deviation. And Renee also does this as well, except he doesn't sit like this, but again, it's like this. What I'm trying to get you to see here is that, I can't tell you there's one way to do it, because Paco de Lucia obviously plays quite well and has a fast rest stroke. But if you try this for yourself, just to experience what it's like, even if you never plan on playing this way, you really have to lift the whole arm up, both like this and kind of like this, in order to reach around the instrument. Whereas if you go back to Renee's sitting position, and you just, I mean, there's really no lifting. It doesn't change a whole lot in terms of like that elbow and the upper arm. If you look at the Segovia school, where you're sitting at a more perpendicular angle, and you look at like an Ida Presti technique, or even if you look at like flamencos like Paco Peña or Paco de Lucia when they play like this, this sort of old school flamenco way of playing, this position tends to yield a technique that's driven more by elbow displacement type. So what you'll see with those players is, whether it's Paco de Lucia, if you watch the black and white video of him playing like this, or you see Segovia or Ida Presti with a footstool playing like this, which I don't have a footstool, unfortunately, you'll see that they have, a deviated towards the pinky, and then they use the elbow to go from the treble to the bass strings. There is a slight issue with that, in that as you use the elbow, it's going to create some tone inconsistency because you're here in relation to the sound hole, whereas as you go down, you end up more behind the sound hole, so the tone's going to be slightly different. You can do a sort of forearm or shoulder to arm, forearm contact point displacement type like this, though. If you watch, you go. So again, like certain seating positions are going to tend to emphasize whether you use the elbow or the shoulder to arm joint, the type of displacement type you use. But there's no hard and fast rule. There are great players who mix and match seating position with displacement type. There's a number of different solutions, which is kind of why this whole series is about teaching you to observe and see what they're doing for yourself, and observe your own playing and know what your tools are and make your own decisions. Now, the other subject that Renee and I discuss is finger abduction. Because if you watch Paco de Lucia, when he goes so he's sitting like this and he goes to rest stroke, you'll see him make this movement, and then you'll see the fingers spread. And there's two ways that the fingers can spread. One is the abduction muscles of the fingers. So if you keep the wrist aligned in the center of its range of motion in terms of flexion and extension, you can just spread the fingers apart using the abductor muscles. I doubt he's doing that because that's really tense. What I think he's probably doing, and part of the reason I think this is, you can pretty clearly see Grisha Gorjevich does this, and Renee even says, yeah, Grisha does this, is it's a little bit of seesaw displacement to let the wrist flex downwards towards the top of the guitar. And as you flex the wrist, it extends and abducts the fingers a little bit. And I think that does a couple things. I think, one, it gets you a little bit more on the fingertip, where you're getting a lot of nail contact, so you can really slice through the strings. Meaning that, like as you go upwards, you try it for yourself. You can kind of get more just on the nail. I think the second thing is that because flexing the wrist extends the fingers a little bit, you can't flex the fingers in. And when you flex the finger, you can't flex. If you flex the wrist, it extends the fingers and limits the amount of finger flexion that is possible. And so it's going to tighten up the motion, both because you can't flex as far as you might normally if the wrist is at the center of its range of motion, but also because once you flex and release, it's going to kind of stop the fingers from moving, hyperextending in any way. So what I'm kind of getting at is, like, it really tightens up the motions of the fingers a little bit. It also just might be that there's a variety of wrist alignments that work. And there isn't no one way of doing it. Obviously, that's partially the answer to this question, but what I'm trying to get at is, like, maybe this is a bad habit that's okay, and one day Grisha will experience an injury, or maybe it's not. Maybe you can have the wrist a little bit flexed, and it's never going to be a problem, and maybe that doesn't affect you, or it does help you. At this point, I'm not really sure. I'm just trying to walk you through the anatomical way of looking at it and the possible reasons. What I can tell you is, in that conversation, Renee and Kevin definitely get something wrong, which is that they say, well, as you engage and raise that wrist up, it spreads the fingers. When you bring the wrist to the center of its range of motion and or extend it from being flexed, it's going to adduct the fingers, meaning bringing them together, and it's also going to bring them from extended to flex. And you can experience that yourself. If you let it drop, they're going to spread out and extend, and then as you bring it back, they're going to flex inwards and add up. Last thing I want to say about that is if you read Carl Lavaro's method, he talks about toques and fijación. And basically the idea of fijación, or it looks like fijation, if I kind of pronounce it, or fijación, if I were to sort of pronounce it in a sort of literal English, but Fijacion. What he basically says is that you sometimes use the literal translation of fijación is like to sort of stiffen, but he says you don't want to think of it as like super tense or stiff or rigid. It's more like you use some larger muscles to take over or aid the smaller muscles and by implication joints of the body. And I think there's kind of two examples of that. One is like if you were to kind of use the elbow. So kind of like when we talked about in volume engagement, one example of fijación is like using the shoulder to arm joint to press into the string a bit to get more volume, right? We talked about it in the last video. But another example that I think is in the section on toques, Carl Lavaro points to the tip, middle, knuckle, and wrist joints as all different toques, which translates to like techniques, although I think he means it more like tools, even though that's not a literal translation. It's like these are your tools for playing. So the connection I'm trying to make is this. I can't tell you exactly what Carl Lavaro was trying to say. It's somewhat ambiguous. You know, he doesn't have the same anatomy and physiology vocabulary, but when you hear what I'm saying, and you hear all this stuff that I'm talking about anatomy and physiology, and you go back and read Carl Lavaro, you start to see, oh, he's trying to talk about his body and tell you what he's doing. He just doesn't have all the vocabulary to do it. And I think what he's getting at is that there is some relationship, rather than me saying there's any one way that he's trying to point to how you play, I think what I'm trying to make a connection of now is that I'm not the first person or first, there are great players that I can point to like Carl Lavaro who are pointing to these different tools of the body, and the way he specifically points to the toques of the wrist, knuckle, middle, and tip joint, he says these are tools that you need to consider when playing effectively and playing fast. And there's also a point too where he talks about the whole hand-arm complex. And again, I think that he's trying to get at how the whole arm is involved in shaping and positioning and aiding the hand and the fingers to execute guitar technique, and you have to become aware of and consider all of these, which is why he has that section on right-hand displacement types. It's why he has the section on toques. To kind of tie a bow on this whole conversation, because it got a bit wordy, what I'm trying to get at here is I don't think the stuff that I'm saying to you, I'm the only one saying it. I think Carl Lavaro was trying to say it too. He just couldn't describe it as succinctly with the same anatomy and physiology vocabulary as I can to you today, which I owe a lot to